Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Katie Meyer. I'm a government reporter and editor here at Spotlight PA. I'm going to be your moderator for tonight's event. So for those of you who are new to our programming, Spotlight PA is an independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit newsroom. We produce investigative and public service journalism about state government and urgent statewide issues. We can't do any of this work without you, our members, and those of you who support our efforts. So you can learn more about us on our website, spotlightpa.org. Before we get started, a couple housekeeping items. Tonight's event will be recorded and posted on our website tomorrow for those who could not join tonight. Thank you to everybody who submitted a question in advance. And if you want to submit a question during the event, you can do so in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. We will try to get to as many of your questions as possible toward the end of the program. And so now to get into the meat of what we're talking about tonight, school choice vouchers. I want to start with a basic rundown of what school vouchers are generally, and then what's specifically been proposed in Pennsylvania. So first off, there's a lot that's contentious about this issue. You probably know that already. And that includes the word voucher itself. So a lot of supporters of this kind of program prefer using the word scholarship. I am going to use voucher. That is just for clarity because they're distinct from regular scholarships. I'm also defining vouchers as any program that takes public money and routes it directly to tuition at a private and or religious school. So within that definition, there are tons of different voucher programs. We're going to get into some of those distinctions as part of our discussion. But I do want to talk about one proposed voucher program. That's one of the most prominent proposals in Pennsylvania. It is known as the Pennsylvania Awards for Student Success, or PASS program. So that's how I'm going to refer to it. Just briefly, if passed, that program would include income limits for participating families. It would be a max of about $78,000 annually for a family of 4. It would also be limited to children who live in poor school districts. At least to start, it would cost the state $100 million annually. There is so much more to say on this issue. So with me today to hopefully shed some light on it and talk through some of the things that make vouchers so contentious are 3 panelists. So I am going to have them introduce themselves. And Senator, I'd like to start with you, Senator Williams.
Good evening. How are you?
Good.
Good. Well, now, what did you like me to?
So just introduce yourself if you could.
Oh, sure. My name is Anthony Williams, state senator from Philadelphia, Delaware County, primarily Southwest South Philadelphia, parts of Delaware County, closest to the line. Been in the General Assembly for several decades now. Represent the 8th Senatorial District.
All right. And then Susan Spica, let's go to you.
Thanks for having me on. So I'm Susan Spica. I'm the Executive Director of Education Voters of Pennsylvania, which is a statewide policy and advocacy organization that really works hard to help ensure that students can go to welcoming and inclusive and well-funded schools where they can, have the resources they need to be able to be successful today and then in life after graduation. And I live in the center of the state in Shippensburg, which straddles Cumberland and Franklin counties.
All right. And last but not least, Patrick Wolf.
Hi, I am Patrick Wolf, and I am the Distinguished Professor of Education Policy at the University of Arkansas. I also hold the chair in school choice. I've been evaluating private school voucher programs for the last 25 years. So I started when I was 8.
Very good. And we should say, so these folks represent a number of views on vouchers. Patrick Wolf, generally supportive of them as a concept in his work, and he also just, as a researcher, knows a lot of the distinctions about what makes a voucher program work in certain ways. Susan Spica, a public school advocate, generally does not support vouchers. Senator Williams, a Democrat, often has a different take on them than many of his Democratic colleagues, but has been very supportive of vouchers for, years in his career, as well as just school choice in general. So with that out of the way, I would love to start with you, Susan. We've mentioned a couple times that this is a contentious issue, and I want to make it clear, talking to all of you, about why it's contentious. So Susan, can you just briefly give me a rundown of why public education advocates tend to oppose vouchers?
Yep. So, public schools, they have their doors open to every school and every student in the community who enters. They are required by law to educate all students. We invest in our public schools as communities, and they are a public good where, all of our kids can go there. And we have a shared interest in supporting the public education in Pennsylvania. We also have a constitutional mandate. It's like one of the only things in Pennsylvania's constitution, which is a requirement to provide for a thorough and efficient system of public education. The legislature is right now in violation of the Constitution, and as there is only one pot of money in Harrisburg, when you start taking money away and putting it into funding private school vouchers, that means necessarily there are fewer dollars to fund public schools. And then, finally, voucher schools can and do discriminate against students for like basically almost any reason. And so it is just wrong to use tax dollars to advance discrimination against children in the way that voucher schools do.
And I'll make a couple notes there. Susan, you referred to that court ruling. It was last year, the Commonwealth Court ruled that Pennsylvania's public school system is unconstitutionally inequitable, and so ordered the legislature to fix it. Didn't really give a formula to fix it. So lawmakers have been working on that since then. And I do also want to just add a note of context on what you said about the discrimination, because I do think it's important. So Pennsylvania's Human Relations Act bars discrimination based on race, religion, disability, but that actually just explicitly doesn't apply to private schools. And so while there are some federal protections on things like race, private schools are allowed to, for instance, kick out a student if they become pregnant or if they are LGBTQ. So that's something that comes up a lot. So now, Senator Williams, I want to kind of ask you the same question. Contentious issue, you've supported vouchers for years and school choice generally. Tell me a little bit about that position.
All right, let me start with some basic premises that I always hear. I don't consider it contentious. I've been in the General Assembly for almost over 30 years now. I've been reelected multiple times, even with competition. It is, if you go to a small community, if you go to a community that is of color primarily, underperforming schools, dangerous public schools, and you keep funding it, which I have done, and people tend to pit those who support vouchers versus those who don't support public education. That's a lie. There's a lot of hypocrisy. I voted for every tax increase in Pennsylvania, and I still have failing high schools in my district. How many generations should we allow for children and parents not to have options other than the middle class and the affluent? It's that basic. We do have a constitutional responsibility to educate people in Pennsylvania. And so for me, this is not a matter of whether you support public education. We know that we have sent bucket loads of money within the last 10 years. Unfortunately, they just have not provided return. We all hope that they do, provide some return. And also, frankly, I'm tired of hearing people saying public schools educate everybody. They do not. In Philadelphia County, you have a magnet system. And by the way, you all know these things, but nobody mentions it when they start talking. You have a magnet system and special admission schools. Guess which schools are successful in Philadelphia? Magnet schools and special admission schools. The demographics of Philadelphia, the largest population of our people of color, specifically African Americans. Guess who the majority population are not in those schools? And everybody sort of like keeps pushing this process along with regard to public education, vouchers are evil, blah, blah, blah. And nobody wants to stop the bleeding, which we have seen for decades, which is, and by the way, this is not my opinion. This is studied information. The difference between a child entering kindergarten and coming out with the illiteracy rate that we have in Philadelphia is directly driving the prison population in Philadelphia across Pennsylvania. So for me, I see the reality. I don't get caught up in the special interests who want more money to pay for whatever they want to pay for or whatever. This is not controversial. This is common sense. And by the way, when you poll people who live in these communities with underperforming schools, that's why you don't put them on ballots. That's why you don't put them on local ballots, because they know that the parents in those areas will come out and vote for them. So this is not a matter of good public policy. This is a matter of politics and some level of hypocrisy.
I think agree to disagree on contentiousness, but thank you so much to both of you for giving us that rundown. And I do want to go into, what we can know about vouchers, what they do, how they've been studied. Patrick Wolf, you have been studying them for years. So one of the things I wanted to ask you about, and one of the things I found interesting about your research is you found pretty notably different student outcomes for different versions of voucher programs over the years. So can you tell me about the differences you have seen between some of the smaller voucher pilots you studied 2 decades ago compared to the statewide programs you've reviewed more recently? And I should say also, this is just framed this way because voucher programs have really changed a lot over the years.
Sure. Yeah, the first wave of school voucher experiments were in urban areas. We had the opportunity to use rigorous experimental methods to evaluate them. There were more students who wanted to participate in those programs than there were vouchers to hand out. And so we used lotteries to decide who got the private school voucher opportunity and who didn't. And that set the foundation for a gold standard experimental evaluations of the impacts of the program. We studied the achievement effects of those programs using neutral tests, norm reference tests that measure kind of general educational knowledge and skills and aren't tied to any particular curricula. And we tended to find that private school vouchers had neutral to positive effects on student achievement. The effects were especially consistent and large and in a positive direction for African American students. They were a bit more mixed for Latino and white students participating in these studies. So that was the first wave. The second wave of studies have generally been of statewide programs. They haven't restricted enrollment, so that means you can't do the gold standard random assignment studies in most cases. You have to do the kinds of studies where you try to match students up, the voucher students with the comparison students, and you try to approximate the kind of rigor you get from experimental studies, but you can never be sure that you've gotten there. Another important change has been that the measure of student achievement has switched from neutral tests to tests to the state test that is aligned with the public school curriculum. So there were a lot of changes in that these voucher experiments were being conducted, how they were studied, and how achievement was evaluated. In that second wave, we've seen neutral to negative achievement effects of school vouchers, but we can't really say convincingly why that is. Is it because it's statewide as opposed to urban? Is it because the test is more closely aligned with the public school curriculum than private school curricula? We just don't know for sure, but that's been interesting changes that have taken place. Throughout this process, we've evaluated the effect of private school vouchers on educational attainment. That's how far students go in school. So high school graduation, college enrollment, college completion. There we've seen much more consistent positive effects of school voucher programs. So they tend to have a stronger positive effect on how far you go than they do on how much you know.
All right. And then again, just to recap and make sure that we are all like absorbing everything, because there's a lot of, I think, technical stuff that you're talking about. But earlier programs, you saw more neutral to positive effects. Those were very small programs by and large. These bigger statewide programs, which are very common now, increasingly common, and that is what Pennsylvania's program would be, although of course it's not exactly the same as the ones that you studied. You did see in student achievement specifically, neutral to negative effects from a student going from their public school to a private school via vouchers. And these were over, again, a number of years, right?
Yes, we usually observe a slight drop in achievement the first year because students are switching schools, they have to adjust to a new environment, new expectations, new curriculum. But in the early studies in particular, and in the more rigorous experimental studies, we've seen that the voucher students then gain achievement at a somewhat higher rate than the control group kids, catch up, and eventually by the third or fourth year pass them.
Yeah, and Susan, I saw you noting, I want to give you a chance to chime in. Yeah.
Yeah, just in general, I think that the research that I've read has shown like negative impact on students. And then also I'm just looking, Dr. Wolf, at your 2021 paper that you did about the Louisiana Scholarship Program. And it said that, when considering the likelihood of students entering college, we observed no statistically significant difference between scholarship users and their counterparts. And I thought you said a minute ago that like you saw much better outcomes for students like after they graduated, so like when they were in their voucher schools, it was neutral to negative, but you said after they graduate, it gets better, but it seems like in Louisiana, your study shows it didn't. So I just think I'm just trying to understand it because I think that's really important when we think about investing dollars and when we think actually about like the actual real human being children who are going to be impacted by these policies.
Do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, so my Louisiana study was one of the few school voucher evaluations that didn't show attainment gains for students in terms of high school graduation and college enrollment. Other studies I've led of Washington, D.C. and the Milwaukee programs, other studies of New York City and Florida that other scholars have done have all showed a very consistent pattern of positive effects of school voucher programs on educational attainment.
Yeah, I would love to have you share those with me because I have not found them and I've looked pretty hard. So like maybe we can talk offline after this. So thank you.
And this is, again, studies we're referencing over several decades, right, Patrick? Yeah. And Senator Williams, I did have a question for you, and then I'll let you respond to whatever. But one of the things, just to keep it moving, I wanted to ask you about, and maybe this is something that you're thinking about too, in terms of student achievement, and in terms of, I think, ensuring, quality of schools that kids are sent to. Private schools don't always have the same level of transparency and disclosure that a public school would. So are there measures that you support or that you are interested in that would ensure, levels of oversight for the schools that kids are sent to using these programs?
Well, the first thing I want to make sure is that that the program goes to those who are most in need, which, by the way, none of these do. Even though this proposal doesn't go as far as I think it should go. It's not $100 million is not a lot of money for the problem that we have across Pennsylvania. And given the amount of money we sent to public education this year, traditional public education this year, we should have certainly found a way to deal with this issue. But to the extent that people are concerned about test scores, performance, schools not closing in the middle of the year, I do actually think that we have to do safeguards to make sure none of that can happen if you're going to give money to traditional publics and privates, which we don't have safeguards for either. And we don't do a lot of reporting in those spaces, but I agree with those who are concerned about public dollars or some form of a tax credit going to a private institution without measurements of success. You should always measure whether students are achieving. Now, that may be a variety of measurements, socially norming, academic performance, getting accepted to college. There may be a variety of those things that occur, but I definitely think there should be measurement of performances attached to those kinds of things. I do have a question, though. There's a few questions I see sort of specifically directed at me, which hopefully we'll get to, and I'm fine answering them.
We'll get
They're
to
all
this at the end,
the
yeah.
politics of it. The other thing I want to say is this, the format, I'm fine with the format, but these things tend to go, what's wrong with vouchers? And we're online in Pennsylvania where I can count multiple school districts. We have 600 school districts, and no one's saying, why do we have 600 school districts? Well, no one's talking about how to reform the educational process of getting teachers into the pipeline, how we get more diversity within the teaching population, how do we catch up with there's a variety of reasons beyond money, and people keep suggesting vouchers don't do as well and it's about money. Well, with all due respect, because we are held harmless in Pennsylvania, the difference between what we spend in Philadelphia County versus Montgomery County is about $4,000. So we can no longer simply say it's about the money. It's about the systems that are not adequately preparing teachers, and they will tell you themselves, being thrown into classrooms that they're not prepared to teach in. There's a whole array of things as the building burns that we need to discuss to figure out how to put out the fire and rebuild the building. Vouchers is one item. It is not a panacea. It will not fix. I don't look at it as if you get all vouchers, everything's going to fix. No, it's not. It's a Band-Aid, but we have a bigger problem.
And real quick, so understood, education, big topic. We would need many more hours, I think, to expand our scope significantly. So I would like to keep it focused on vouchers as a proposal because it's a significant proposal and it would be a change for the state. And so that's why I want to keep it limited to that. But yeah, Susan, I want to give you one more chance to respond to whatever.
Yep, no, I appreciate the senator's comment that there should be an academic accountability piece if we are going to be sending dollars to these private schools. And so like, I don't, Senator Williams, like, is that something that we can expect to see from you in this legislation? And the other thing is like, we have had, and I understand that we've had the EITC and OSTC tax credit programs that next year are going to provide $525 million in funding. I will not say tax funding because you don't want me to, but in
Yeah,
state support. Can we say it's state support? Because it is state support.
it's up to, go ahead, you finish your point now.
So, but we've spent like over $2 billion as Pennsylvanians on scholarships for students to go to private schools. We have, and that's been in place since 2001. And in no time since 2001 has there been any attempt or any ability for anyone to understand the academic outcomes of the students who've gone into those schools. And so I think that it's hard to tell parents like that they should take a voucher and send their kid to a school if that parent is not going to have any type of actual data about their kid and how they perform. Because I can tell you that they're like, if you go to a religious schools don't have to be accredited. They don't have to abide by any meaningful curriculum standards. The Bible might be the only thing that students learn, and they might sit in a cubby all day and do nothing but memorize Bible verses. And that literally happens in a school that's about 3 miles from my house. So I just think that if you really believe that, I would love to see you be a champion for that, both in the EITC and OSTC legislation and in any new voucher bill, because that is like a really critical component that's missing in Pennsylvania, for sure.
So
Real quick,
let me,
just to give a point of context, and then Senator, of course, I'll let you talk, but EITC and OSTC, for anyone who doesn't know that, we have these two long-standing tax credits in Pennsylvania. The way that they roughly work, because it's a little bit more complicated, but they allow businesses and individuals to give to organizations that then fund scholarships to students who want to attend private schools. And they get a tax credit in return, or a tax break in return for funding those scholarships. So it's a little bit similar to vouchers in that the state is providing a benefit to people who fund public school or private school tuition. There's more steps in the middle of it. But one of the things that Susan was referencing was that in the decades since this program was formed, it has grown pretty exponentially. And we don't have a lot of data available on who gets that money, who gets those scholarships, the salaries of the parents of the students who take advantage of them, that kind of thing. So Senator Williams, sorry to interrupt you, but I wanted to provide some context. Yeah, in terms of oversight, I think you and I have talked about this before. What would you say?
well, I'll say several things. One, is it Susan?
Susan.
Okay. Absolutely. But I'm a man on an island pretty much by myself. I don't believe the AITC, OSTC is doing what it should do. I was one of the ones who helped, support its creation with the intent of helping children who are underserved in areas that are not populated well. This EITC program is now for the middle class, and a significant population of white suburbanites use it to send their kids to. And by the way, I don't worry about those schools they're sending their kids to are really good schools, but they have the money to pay for them. But I'm happy to support an academic review of outcomes relative to the tax credits. But I frankly feel like it's obscene and it's not doing what I wanted to do. So frankly, when you say what I champion it, if somebody will listen, I mean, because the folks on the Democratic side don't listen to me about we need other options, and the folks on the Republican side sort of placate the populations they want to placate, and I'm in the middle for rural and urban, and urban Pennsylvanians who are getting shortchanged in the educational experience in Pennsylvania. And lastly, the other thing I want to say is this: hopefully, we're going to talk about IEPs, which is a voucher that we have currently, which costs hundreds of thousands of dollars every year, but nobody sort of understands that. Then lastly, I understand, you want to have, when you mentioned, there's kids who are just learning how to read scripture or whatever they're learning at the end of the day. I have a high school in my district which scored 0 proficiency in math and reading. 0 in multiple years. That means they can't read scripture. So I'd like to get to the meat and potatoes, somebody like who's an advocate for public education to at least admit this experience is not working and it's not just about money. And what are we going to do about it?
No, and
It
I
seems,
agree with that. And I did look though, like Philadelphia has all these charter schools, and I saw that 58 of the 83 charter schools are under enrollment. Like, so 67% of these charter schools are under enrollment in Philadelphia right now. So it's not like there isn't choice in Philadelphia, right? And so I just, when we talk about vouchers, we're not just talking about Philadelphia, we're talking about vouchers for the whole state.
oh,
We're
I
talking about
understand that.
putting money into the whole, you know what I mean, into places everywhere, right?
I'm mentioning Philadelphia because I'm familiar with Philadelphia. I can mention
Correct.
school districts across Pennsylvania who have similar scores to Philadelphia that nobody ever mentions. I just
So-
happen to mention the largest one in Pennsylvania.
Right, and
that
there's a lot of
performing
choice.
at- And by the way, wait a minute. There are not a lot of choices in Philadelphia because as I would suggest to you, not every charter school is equal, not every public school is equal. And so therefore, when you tell me, choices available, parents are pretty smart. They know what charter school they want to send their child to because they see the scores. They know the charter school they don't want to send their child to. They know the high school they want to send their child to because it's not safe, it's not working. We don't have enough options for kids who don't have a lot of money. And if people can argue and say to me, hey, poor people are treated the same in this country, state, and in Philadelphia, across Pennsylvania, as if you're middle class, have a job, income, then I'd suggest to you that you're really not being honest.
Senator,
Poor
I want
folks
to
do
keep this
not,
moving
let me
here.
finish,
I gotta-
let me finish. Poor folks do not have all the options that they need to have that other people have.
And it would be good to then shut down some of the charter schools in Philadelphia that aren't doing well. If those are underperforming and you say that there are bad choices.
Why would you not shut down public school? It does the same thing.
All right, guys, we got to move on. We're going to continue this conversation though. I want to now turn to a different thing that comes up a lot of the time in these conversations. And that is the impact on public schools when states initiate voucher programs. Now, Patrick, you've done some research on this. I want to bring you back into this conversation. You've done some research I found really interesting. What have you found happens to public schools in states that have begun voucher programs?
Sure. Well, first of all, it's not Armageddon. There isn't a mass exodus of students out of public schools when a private school choice program, a private school voucher program launches or expands. Typically, 3 to 8% of the eligible population participates in a voucher program in its early years. And there's been a lot of research about what public schools do and what happens to the achievement of their students when they face competition from school vouchers. What they do typically is they communicate more frequently and more effectively with parents. Describing their programs, pitching their programs to parents to help keep the parents anchored in that public school. A second thing they do is they tend to offer new programs, particularly for the kinds of students who have been unhappy and unsuccessful in the school and therefore are at risk of leaving. And third, they are more likely to remove their lowest performing teachers from the classroom and replace them with better teachers. So given that public schools respond in these constructive ways to competition from private school choice, it's not surprising that 27 out of the 30 evaluations of what happens to student test scores under these circumstances find that the students who remain in the public schools actually improve their achievement as a result of competition from school vouchers.
Thank you, Patrick. And I do also now want to, Susan, I was going to get to you next anyway, but you did drop in a link that folks can check out. But I want to tie this into our conversation we were already having about EITC and OSTC, because I do think it's relevant. So one of the reasons those programs are brought up in Pennsylvania is they're an example of a school choice program that has grown significantly since it was initiated. And one of the reasons that Susan and other folks have concerns about voucher programs is that they tend to grow. And so I assume, Susan, is that related to what you wanted to bring up?
Yep, I did. I think that what we've seen in state after state after state after state is that as like we start with a very small voucher program that is for a very limited number of students. There are very strict rules about who can get the voucher. And then another group is added, and then another group is added. And let's be honest, the end game is a universal voucher program, which is what we see in Arizona. And so people come in and say, oh, it's just going to be this program. It's not going to cost that much. Well, in Arizona, not only did students who left their public schools to go to private schools take a voucher, like who could have thunk it? People who have their kids in private schools already are really happy to take a check from the state to help subsidize the tuition that they were paying already. And so I think what we see in states is as voucher programs are expanded, the families who present zero cost to taxpayers because they are able to pay for their own children's private school tuition are suddenly sucking up a $7,000 check from the state every year because who wouldn't take it if they could get it? And in Arizona, it has like completely busted the budget. And I saw in Arkansas, 95% of the students who get vouchers were already in private schools. So when we're talking about this, I think we have to talk about what is the voucher for? Is it truly to provide a brand new opportunity for a child who is in a public school? Or are these vouchers, as we've seen across the nation, are they going to be for everybody? And we saw the same thing in Ohio. They expanded the voucher of eligibility, and almost all of the money went to like wealthy suburbs of cities where there were white families who already had their kids in private schools that were shishi and fancy that they were paying for on their own. And those lucky families now can take that check and go on a really nice vacation. And that all comes at the expense of our public school system and every other public service that is funded by the state. So that is the reality of what happens when we expand vouchers. And these are the cash handout vouchers where you take a family and you write them a check and they take the money and they do whatever they want with it. And the fraud and abuse that we have seen in Arizona and Florida are like so staggering. It is almost unbelievable. Like when you look at how people spend these voucher dollars, that dollars that are supposed to be spent educating kids, you can't believe it, but it's true.
Patrick, I do want to ask you a follow-up question based on that and let you respond as well. I know your research has looked a lot at the effects of different formulations of voucher programs, and I think that's one of the several things that Susan's talking about, just when a voucher program is statewide versus defined, if it applies to everyone or has income limits. Can you talk about the effective results that you get from those changes?
Sure. First of all, I just want to correct the record. Those figures that are thrown about 95% or 75% of the students using private school vouchers are already in private schools. Those numbers are inflated by the fact that students are continuing in the program after having switched from a public school into a private school the first year. For example, in Arkansas, with our Education Freedom Accounts program, the very first year of that program, which was 2 years ago, not a single current private school students was enrolled in that program. But enough of them continued in the program in the second year that you get this inflated number. It doesn't mean that these students were always in private schools. It means that in many cases that they're continuing in the program. So what we've seen in terms of which programs are successful and which ones struggle is a lot of it depends on the quality and variety of private schools that participate in the program, because a private school voucher program is only as good as the private school providers who participate. And in Louisiana, I think my Louisiana evaluation is really a cautionary tale, because the Louisiana Scholarship Program was the most heavily regulated school voucher program in history. And as a result, only a third of the private schools in Louisiana agreed to participate in that program. And it wasn't the highest quality third either. It was the third that was desperate to get students and to get revenue. And so that's really a cautionary tale. And the two regulations that really discourage quality schools from participating is, one, the prohibition from them administering any admissions requirements. So if they have an admissions test to determine if a child is prepared to succeed in their school, they can't apply that admissions test. So that scared away a lot of quality schools. And the second one is the requirement to administer the state accountability test and report those results publicly, because many private schools use alternative curriculums. They sequence certain ideas, concepts, and skills at a different level at a different time. And as a result, they don't want to inflict the state test on their students because their students aren't prepared to do well at it. So those two regulations, open admissions and mandating the state test, chase away a lot of the quality providers and can really undermine the success of private school voucher programs. Most private schools are willing to administer a neutral test of their choosing that they think fits the curriculum that they are teaching to their students, but they really resist administering the state test.
All right. And did either one of you want to chime in on this before we move on?
I mean, it just sounds like it sounds like the schools in Louisiana and the schools everywhere want to be able to like have their cake and eat it too. They want to be able to have whatever admission standards they want. So if kids have disabilities, they want to be able to tell them they can't come. Disciplinary problems, don't like the parents aren't the right religion, kids pregnant, kids LGBTQ+. They want to be able to discriminate and choose their kids and get tax dollars for it. And I think that is like the problem that we have here with these voucher programs. It's like, that's how they work. If you have a voucher program, you are subsidizing and advancing discrimination for like a gazillion different reasons against children. And in the schools in Louisiana, clearly we're saying it's not worth it. The money's not worth it. We want to be able to discriminate.
So I'm going to jump in here. These are the conversations that frustrate me. If you don't know, the Philadelphia School District in Cross, Pennsylvania, we're in court currently because of anti-Semitic comments made in the public school systems. Discrimination is not simply, private school versus public school. It's everywhere. And it has teachers in every segment involved in it. And I want to hear people admit that. This is not about a voucher. We make the voucher the boogeyman as opposed to deal with the problem that we actually have. And I've not heard one comment. I'm reading the comments now. It's either about how you raise your money, who you're associated with, vouchers going to do, not one admission that the public experience is not failing simply because of money. So when are we I heard the comment about why don't you close more charters? Charters are being closed at a record rate in Philadelphia that aren't performing. But the school I mentioned that's been open since I was a child, that is zero proficiency performance, you didn't comment on that. It's not closed, will not be closed. And the children in that community who are poor and brown that you're concerned about are being discriminated against every single day because they don't have options. I want to hear somebody respond to that. And if you have a different idea, tell me what it is.
Is there a private school that would accept every single child?
This is not about
regardless of disability, regardless of behavior, regardless of attendance, regardless of all of that. I mean, that's the issue, right? Like,
no, it's not.
Because that is the issue, because it is telling people a story that they are going to get a magic ticket to go to some fancy shishi private school, no matter what problems their kid has. When in fact, we know that most private schools will say to families of kids with disabilities, I'm sorry, we can't meet your child's needs. Like, we work with families of kids with disabilities.
With all due respect,
find a school outside of their public school that would even contemplate enrolling their child. So that is discriminate. And like, where are those kids supposed to go then?
So for the record, this is not about shishi schools. In the 60s and 70s, there was an explosion of small private schools, yes, religious schools included, art schools included, that were run when they could afford them in communities of color. And the Speaker of the House went to one of those schools. It wasn't a shishi school in the suburbs. So the narrative, which is being described by people who don't live where I live, with population of people who I work with and live with, that's not the narrative we're talking about. And so with all due respect, the people in my neighborhood are not getting accepted to Central. They're not getting accepted to arts. I need to, Penn Alexander is a stone throw, 1.5 miles from where I live. There's not a kid from Cobbs Creek that's in that school. Not one. They're not admitted. So this narrative about one versus the other, the suburb, this is not about that for me. And I'd like people to catch up to the reality where the population that we're talking about, the underserved, not simply because of money, but because of support, and describing all these things because of the hypocrisy in the process, respond to that. But you don't. You keep talking about the boogeyman, the voucher, and you keep saying there's choices, but they're not.
Senator, we got to get to audience questions, and I want to make sure
Sure.
we get a chance
No problem.
thank you.
I just want to add, though, quickly that
go ahead, Patrick.
15% of the enrollments in school voucher programs right now are in programs that are limited to students with disabilities. And the Florida McKay Scholarship Program, they're private schools providing education to over 80,000 kids with disabilities through their voucher program. So it is a canard that private schools don't want to and won't serve kids with disabilities. Well-designed and well-structured school voucher programs for kids with disabilities are thriving across the country.
If there is a school that is in an area that a child can access, right? So if you're in rural Pennsylvania and your child has a disability, good luck, right? Or if you're in another area where they don't have one of these specialized schools, like what are you supposed to do? You know what I mean? Like be on a bus 5 hours a day. So I understand that there might be some specific schools that do a very good job, and there might be some like very small limited voucher programs that address, you know, the issue of this. But in general, if you are a family with a child with a disability, a voucher is not a ticket that is going to be magical and give your kid like some fancy, wonderful education. People are being sold a story that this voucher is going to be everything and everything to them. And the reality is these schools can pick and choose who they want. And depending on where you live, you might not even have an option. And when you take this money and you put it in voucher schools, you're taking it away from the whole system, and you're making it so that the public schools don't have the money to educate all of the kids, the 90% of kids who actually really truly need them.
And I would suggest to you IEPs. I think you know what an IEP is.
We can't
That
get
is
into
a very high ticketed. It is a very high ticketed voucher for those who are disabled, and they've been using them in the system forever, and they're very expensive. I mean, if we're going to talk about this, then put it all on the table. You can't just talk about one segment of it. You're much too smart.
We got to get into audience questions.
Okay, I'm sorry. I apologize.
So one of the ones that I would like to bring up to you folks is that this is from Denise D, and it is about property taxes, which I think, of course, is a thing that unites us all. So Denise wants to know, why don't we address the real problem, which is the fact that schools are funded by real estate taxes, and this inequitable funding produces poor results for poor school districts. So again, I've mentioned this before, but as a note of context, Pennsylvania is working underneath this large Commonwealth Court ruling that ruled that, yes, our schools are unconstitutionally inequitably funded, our public schools, and the legislature is charged with fixing that. So to Denise's question, is there, and maybe Senator, this could go to you, not to make you answer for the entire state government, but is there a deeper problem that cannot be addressed by school choice here?
Yeah. You know, this is 30 years ago. We went to court. Same thing happened. Court did not prescribe a formula, left it to the General Assembly, and politics took over. That's what we're doing tonight. Politics takes over everything. And so without the courts directing us, you know, we made a big investment this year with a commitment to do this. I think it's the next 7 or 8 years. Between now and then, we'll have another governor, other members of the General Assembly, and we'll be talking about spending more money and children not being served properly and fighting. In the meantime, a high school class will go out who's not able to read or write. So those of us who support public education, and I'm included in that, whether people like it or not, who vote for these things, knows how the system works. That's why I'm frustrated, because people who are on the bottom can't get their way out of this thing. It is impossible to live in certain sections of the city and think you're going to get the same education as a person who lives in center city. You're not. And the same is true across Pennsylvania. Rural Pennsylvania is the same thing, as been mentioned already. That being said, you know, there was a commitment this year to increase the funding significantly. That's a good first step. But as many people were educational advocates, they were not happy with the fact that it wasn't prescribed and not codified as they should be, because there's no guarantees that, you know, somebody will not show up in the General Assembly who says, I'm against public education.
And Susan, I want to kind of pose a question to you, and this is in response, it's not a single audience question, but we're sort of getting a lot of different versions of this. So I want to ask it sort of en masse. Given that we are under this mandate to really reform how public education works in Pennsylvania. It's started to happen. There were new funding formulas that were pushed out this year, but some folks like Senator Williams think school choice should be part of that. You do not. What's the approach that you think works best in terms of addressing, poor urban districts, but also districts across the rest of the Commonwealth?
So, listening, COVID, the one bright light in COVID was that we were able to actually listen to the trial in Commonwealth Court, and we heard day after day after day after day about the lack of resources that were in the school districts that have low property values, that are not able to raise the necessary funding that they need to pay for what their students actually need to be successful in schools. And that is because the state in Pennsylvania provides a really shamefully low share of funding for public education, like 38%. Normal states spend about 50%. So this over reliance on property taxes has, as this listener pointed out, created these vast gaps, right? And also these school districts that just cannot on their own dig out and provide students with what they need. So the solution is to do what the Basic Education Funding System or Basic Education Funding Commission suggested, and what the legislature took a first step toward doing this year with Governor Shapiro by saying we're going to make a commitment. First, really truly, there's a gap that each school district has between what they're spending and what we know the students need. There's formula that they put in place. We are going to fill that gap. And when you fill that gap, what you do is you fill the classrooms with aides. You fill the classrooms with ESL teachers, with math teachers, with AP courses, and you can create schools that actually have what students need. So I think that is like #1 priority for the Pennsylvania legislature. And when we also have this $525 million that are being spent on vouchers, I don't understand why the legislature can't say, we are going to take those income limits and put those income limits from $150,000 for a family of 4, we're going to put that down to the $78,000 that Senator Williams supports. And we are going to drive those dollars into the communities that Senator Williams is talking about. And we are going to make this money work for the families that we feel very strongly need these additional options. And we're not going to take this money and spread it around, all the private schools that are on the main line. That is a choice that can be made in Harrisburg, right? That is a choice that could have been made in 2001. But for whatever reason, there are a lot of people who talk about how they want to help these very poor children, right? But we can't get to funding the public schools. And then we've got $500 million paying for vouchers, but the voucher money is going to middle-class kids. It is the legislature that has the complete power to take that $500 million. We don't need a brand new voucher program on top of a voucher program that we already have. We need to fix the one that we have. We need to make sure it's going to kids who need it. We need to have academic accountability. We need to have financial accountability. We know nothing about it. The law prohibits the collection of any data about anything. So let's get that straightened out and drive that money to the places where Senator Williams really truly believes that kids need the dollars, and then let's talk. But the idea of a new voucher program in this environment is just idiocy.
And just to, Senator, I want to kind of direct that question to you because other folks have brought it up as well. But to be clear, again, so Susan's referring to EITC and OSTC, those tax credit programs, wondering why can we not simply take the income limits that you've proposed in your voucher bill, apply them to this program that already exists? Can you talk about the politics of that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, it sounded great what she said, and I saw about yay. If it was that simple, we would have done it, right? In this budget cycle that we just passed, more money coming to public education than ever has occurred. There was a debate about where the money went. And it didn't go to the districts that I'm talking about. It went across the panacea to the politically connected, and that's the General Assembly. And that's been the General Assembly. I've been there over 30 years. It's not changed. With all due respect, it's not going to change. And parents don't have the capacity anymore to allow their child to do, to underperform because we can't get our act together as a community of people and human beings to one another. So while she said a lot of great things, I challenge her to tell me how to do it politically in the environment in which we live in Pennsylvania,
Well,
even if
real
we're
quick,
the same
Senator,
party.
Let's name some names. So who, and in the interest of, maybe making this more concrete, where does the opposition to putting income limits on an existing program like EITC, OSTC, where does that come from? Who opposes these things?
Well, I mean, I guess we want to say Democrat versus Republican. Okay, I guess that's what we want to say.
No, I don't know. I'm asking you.
Well, I know, but you know more. You're Katie, you're a pretty smart woman.
Thank you.
And I appreciate you asking me the question. That being said, there is a political divide. Republicans are interested in the EITC, Democrats are not. No one has done what I've done and said, look, let's compromise and figure out what works best for children, not lobbyists, not the teachers union, not the ones who are getting paid off these kids. Let's figure out how we're going to do something fair for everybody. That's not got there. You have the governor who's invested his time. You have the Democrat, Republican, you have the House and Senate. Those bodies have not agreed upon anything, not just in education, but in anything generally. And when we come with compromises, they're not perfect. And so you can leave it to the way we're organized as a body, and the compromise has to be part of it. But, you know, everybody just says the same thing. We're for education, and we go back to the same conversations we're having tonight. And unfortunately, those on the bottom don't have the lobbyists, don't have the resources, don't write a check to a campaign, and therefore they get stepped over.
But
I
I
don't
guess,
wanna,
you know, like maybe you could introduce a bill that just says we're going to lower the
I've done
income.
all that. I've done all
I've
that.
never seen it. I've never seen it. So
Well,
I
okay,
will like link
send the
arms
bill.
with you in Harrisburg. We can go together and do it together. Senator Williams, like lower the income limit for
Building a
EITC and
coalition.
OSBC. I'll be
Um,
there.
I'm sorry,
busy.
we've been neglecting Patrick, so I want to get him a question. This is an anonymous question, and it is Patrick. So you've mentioned a lot of different ways to formulate a voucher system. Which ones do you think work the best? What leads to the best outcomes that you have seen?
Well, I think the education savings account model is a superior model because it allows parents to choose beyond just private school providers. It allows them to fully customize their child's education. They can use those resources to pay for private school tuition and fees, but they can alternatively use them to pay for tutoring, for online courses, for educational technology, for therapies, for educational therapies. And so, you know, the metaphor that's often used is that school vouchers are like a flip phone, and ESAs are like an iPhone. They're like a smartphone where there's a lot more customization that is allowed. So I think the ESA structure and design is very attractive for many parents, and it gives them a lot more options. In terms of, you know, just returning to how do you design these programs, how do you regulate these programs? I think we can have a healthy debate about means testing and prioritizing serving the most disadvantaged kids. I think the best way to do that is to give them first crack at a new school voucher program. So the first year of the program, it could be limited just to students with disabilities. And the second year of the program, you could add students who are on free and reduced price lunch. So they get first shot at access to the private school providers. And then down the road, you can add, you know, working class and middle class families. Because what we found is these school voucher programs that are carefully targeted to highly disadvantaged kids don't have the political coalition behind them to sustain them. We saw this in Illinois, where the Illinois Invest in Kids Act was eliminated, and 7,000 low-income kids were thrown out of their private schools because they didn't have a broad enough base of support for it. So I support prioritizing serving the more disadvantaged kids in these programs, but also allowing the programs to expand to a broader constituency.
And going back to the studies that we had referenced earlier that you conducted, I think what I had seen reading through them was that the ones where they were very limited, they were limited to low-income children. Those were the ones where you really more consistently saw improvements, right?
That's correct, especially for African-American kids. And basically what we found is for them, the movement out of their neighborhood assigned public school to a private school of choice represented a larger upside gain in terms of the educational environment they experienced. So they showed more clearly that this was having a positive effect on their achievement.
All right. We have literally so many more questions here, but I am reluctant to open another can of worms, so I don't want to ask anything too complicated. What What I am going to do is we've got 3 minutes left, a minute for each of you. Having gone through this great discussion where we all said many things, what's briefly the thing that you think is most important to take away from a conversation like this about school choice vouchers? And Patrick, I'll start with you.
So, I mean, first of all, in studying this program in many different ways, quantitatively, qualitatively, talking to parents and providers, I think we have to keep in mind that parents are the world's foremost experts on the needs of their children. And so basically, education works best when it's viewed as a team sport, as a partnership between schools and parents. And what we've seen is that when parents control the resources and control the choices, schools are much more responsive to them and their needs. And there tends to be much more of this partnership in serving the educational needs of the child. And so that's a big takeaway that I've drawn from my 25 years of research on this question.
All right, Susan, final statement from you.
Yeah, school vouchers are just a really effective mechanism to take tax dollars and to really eviscerate a public good that benefits an entire state or an entire nation, and take those dollars and put them into private pockets. And they are like literally the holy grail of many people who, like the authors of Project 2025, who have been trying to get these things in place for decades, right? They allow discrimination. They allow religious schools to promote like Christian nationalism in Pennsylvania. Like, I'll put my report in there. You can read it and you can see what some of these schools are teaching kids using our tax dollars. We are in a moment in history when we're going to go one way or another. And I think most of us who are here, many of us went to public schools. Many of us live in communities where the only game in town is the public school. It is the only choice our kids have is our public school. There are no private schools in most of Pennsylvania. We need to follow the Pennsylvania Constitution. We need our lawmakers to double down on that and to support our public schools. And they also need to get this EITC program into some type of array. And it is unaccountable. It is a mess. We know nothing about it. And we spend $500 million a year on it. So that's where I stand. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. And then Senator, 1 minute. What would you like to say in summary?
Well, let me thank Spotlight for doing this event. Katie as well. Thank you for inviting me. Patrick and Susan, thank you so much. Look, I've read some of the comments. I don't support 2025. I think people know that. Should know that if you know anything about me. Equally as important, I do think that we have to get to a point where we start speaking honestly about the deficiencies in this process, well beyond simply the money. I think people need to understand that, somebody said to me about, Patrick and Susan were fine in their comments and I was a little bit disrespectful. I don't mean any disrespect, but understand I live someplace where people go to jail. They don't miss going to Harvard and have to go to Columbia. They go to jail because the educational experience that they're receiving is not what they need. And so I apologize not for my passion. It is not disrespect. It is screaming from the neighborhoods that these schools have not been working for 30 years and more. My mom is a retired public school teacher. My aunts and uncles, I get advice from people in the school system all the time. Down the street from me is Anderson Elementary School, from which I attended. The principal and I talk about these things all the time. It's a much more complicated issue than just simply picking out one item, a charter school or a voucher or choice, as why we're not doing what we need to do for these children. Now, my hope is that we begin to listen, and I've said consistently, information that people can actually take the time to come visit. Come visit. Susan, you want to come visit some of my schools with me? Please. Katie, please. Happy for you all to take a tour so you can listen to the parents, not me, the parents about what they need and what they want in these schools. So thank you very much for doing this.
Thank you all. I do want to end on a note where I'm just going to mention this because we didn't get into it in this conversation. I do think it's a very important part of the education conversation here in Pennsylvania. Spotlight, I'll just refer you to some of the reporting we've done on this. A ton of money pours into all corners of education advocacy. We do have more than one billionaire who is very supportive of school choice in Pennsylvania and has put an enormous amount of money into funding it. And so that does really color the political conversation that we have about this. Again, we don't have time to get into it. That is one of the reasons I didn't bring it up because, it's a big issue, but we've done a ton of reporting on it. I encourage everyone to go check that out. So with that said, I just wanted to make sure I noted that dynamic that we didn't get to discuss. But thank you all so much for your participation. This is a huge issue. I feel like we just scratched the surface, but thank you for everybody who left comments. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them. Hopefully we gave a relatively comprehensive view for a lot of the things you wanted to know about. And once again, Patrick, Susan, Senator Williams, this was wonderful. I appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you
Thanks
for
very much.
hosting us.
Appreciate for having
Thank
me.
you.
Thank you.
Good evening.
Thanks for
everyone.
having me.
Bye-bye.
Bye.